The paper trembled slightly between Jonathan's fingers as he read over the bill of sale again. 5 years ago, the original owner of the neighboring parcel, a kind old woman named Marion, had insisted he take ownership of the gate itself. When she moved to an assisted living facility, she'd said it was easier that way, in case anything ever came up. At the time, he hadn't thought twice about it. A gate was just a gate. A rusty metal frame with a broken hinge and flaking paint. But as he now stared down at the signed paper with her neat cursive, and the county clerk's stamp at the bottom, it no longer felt like a simple token gesture. He stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and approached the fence. The construction was recent fresh, sawdust still clung to the gravel. The boards were bolted in tight, and the gate itself had been drilled into new concrete footers. But the gate frame was unmistakably the same old metal one Marion had left. Behind the hinges had been replaced, and a glossy black chain now kept it locked. But it was his gate. Jonathan ran his hand over the steel. The HOA had built a wall and tried to claim the very thing he owned. They hadn't removed the gate, they'd simply locked it, assuming control. He went back inside and opened his laptop. A few searches led him to zoning codes and easement agreements tied to his neighborhood. What he found confirmed what he suspected. The gravel path was technically a right-of-way, but not deeded to the HOA. It was a utility and rear access corridor established years before the HOA even existed. That made Claire's fence not only aggressive, but potentially illegal. The next morning, Jonathan walked to the HOA office. He didn't bring papers, and he didn't bring a warning. He just stood at the fence and stared, hands in his pockets. Claire came outside eventually, her smile forced. "You seem tense," she said. "Is there something you need?" "Just came to look at my gate," he replied calmly. She raised an eyebrow. "Your gate?" He nodded. "Bought it 5 years. I go from Marion, signed deed and all. I've got the paperwork, filed with the county." Claire's expression changed subtly. She didn't lose her composure, but her eyes flickered just long enough for him to catch it. "I see," she said. "Well, we'll look into it. In the meantime, you'll still need board permission for any changes to shared structures." Jonathan gave a faint smile. "I'm not changing anything. Just reminding you that you've locked your fence to something that doesn't belong to you." He turned and walked away, but not before noticing a group of neighbors across the street watching. The exchange? One of the men, older man named Fred, gave a small nod of approval. Back at home, Jonathan retrieved a small toolbox from his garage. It took less than 5 minutes to cut through the padlock with a bolt cutter. The chain clattered to the ground. He opened the gate wide and stood there in silence, letting the breeze drift through the opening. He didn't say a word. He didn't send an email. He didn't call anyone. He simply waited, because when you quietly undo someone's trap and leave it hanging open for the world to see, they'll come running fast, and Jonathan wanted to see exactly who came first. The next morning, Jonathan didn't need an alarm clock. The banging started just after 7 a.m. He walked outside to find 2 HOA board members standing at the gate. Claire wasn't with them. One of the men, wearing a golf hat and clutching a clipboard, pointed a shaky finger at the open entrance. "Sir, we're going to need you to resecure this immediately. That gate was locked under HOA authority. You can't just..." Jonathan held up a hand. "Let's not pretend this is about safety. You locked me out of my own property using a gate that belongs to me. I removed your lock from my gate." The second man, slightly younger, looked uncomfortable. He glanced toward the clipboard man but said nothing. The two exchanged a look, then stepped back. "We'll be speaking with our legal counsel," the first man muttered. Jonathan gave a slight nod. "Please do." As they walked away, the breeze pushed the gate open a little wider, creaking softly. It was theatrical, almost too perfect. Jonathan didn't plan it that way, but the moment had a quiet authority that lingered long after the men left. By noon, Jonathan received an email from the HOA. It was sterile, informal, citing non-compliance with updated entry policies, and demanding that he cease unauthorized gate tampering. He noticed something curious, though. The letter didn't mention ownership of the gate, not once, as if they were trying to avoid saying anything they might regret in writing. That evening, he visited Carl, the neighbor who'd messaged him the day the fence went up. Carl lived a few houses down, and had been part of the HOA years ago, before quitting due to internal drama. "I heard they came knocking," Carl said as they sat on his back porch. "They're rattled," Jonathan said. "Didn't realize I had the deed to the gate?" Carl chuckled. "That's not even the half of it." Jonathan leaned in. "What do you mean?" Carl took a sip of coffee and looked toward the distant fence line. "There's been talk. Claire's pushing for a community enhancement zone behind your lot. A pocket park or something like that. But the board was told they needed full access, your rear road included. She thought if she cut it off early, you'd fold or sell it cheap." Jonathan felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "So this fence, this whole thing is a setup?" Carl nodded slowly. "And if you hadn't remembered that old gate transfer, she probably would have gotten away with it." Back at home, Jonathan dug deeper. He combed through HOA meeting records posted online. Most entries were vague, but one notation caught his eye. Potential rezoning impact for Lot 18 if rear access is unified. Lot 18. That was his parcel. He stared at the screen, jaw tightening. They weren't just trying to trap him behind a fence. They were preparing to take what was his and convert it into a selling point for their next community project. Jonathan stood up and walked to the window. The open gate stood in the moonlight, silent, steady, unbending. The HOA thought he'd quietly back down, but now, they'd made it personal. They'd turned his land into a pawn, and that meant the next move was his. But it wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be in public. He'd let the documents speak for him, because when the battle is over control, the strongest move is often the one they never see coming. Jonathan wasn't the kind of man to rush into confrontation. That was what Claire and the board were counting on, that he'd either cave under pressure or respond irrationally, giving them the chance to paint him as difficult. But they didn't know him. He started with paperwork. The next morning, he went down to the county assessor's office and requested every document tied to his land and the adjacent utility easement. The clerk raised an eyebrow when she saw the volume of requests, but she didn't ask questions. By noon, Jonathan had a file folder thick enough to break a desk drawer. Back home, he laid everything out across his dining table. It was slow, meticulous work plat maps, right-of-way contracts, old zoning files. Some went back 3 decades. But then he found what he was looking for. A development agreement dated nearly 15 years before the HOA had formed. It confirmed that the gravel road behind his lot was to remain a shared access path, untouched, unrestricted, and protected under county ordinance. He also had the deed to the gate, signed, witnessed, and notarized. The metal gate wasn't an extension of any fence. It was its own entity, sold and transferred years ago. In black and white, the fence had been chained to property the HOA had no right to touch. That night, Jonathan drafted a letter not to the HOA, but to the county zoning commission. He included photos, documents, and a statement outlining the HOA's unapproved obstruction of a legal easement. He attached his gate deed at the end and mailed it with tracking. No threats, no noise, just proof. 2 days passed in silence. But the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that presses against your ears before a storm breaks. Then the HOA made their next move. A yellow paper was posted on Jonathan's front door. It was a formal notice from the HOA's compliance office. According to them, his unauthorized gate modifications and destruction of HOA security infrastructure were in violation of community standards. A fine of $200 per day would be imposed until the gate was secured in accordance with board policy. Jonathan read the notice twice and folded it neatly into his file. Then he walked to the gate, which he had since left open, and closed it gently. He didn't chain it shut. He didn't lock it. He simply stood in front of it and waited. He didn't wait long. A white SUV rolled up from the opposite end of the gravel path. Claire stepped out, clipboard in hand, sunglasses masking her expression. She didn't smile. "We've been patient," she said. "You're acting in defiance of HOA authority. That won't go well for you." Jonathan didn't flinch. "The easement behind my property is protected. You've obstructed it without cause. And you locked my gate. I own it." Claire scoffed. "That's your argument? A rusty gate from a neighbor who moved away?" Jonathan handed her a single piece of paper, a copy of the deed. She stared at it for several seconds before lowering her clipboard. "You think this changes anything?" Jonathan looked past her at the fence, at the gravel road running through the back lots. "It already has." Claire didn't respond. She turned, climbed back into her SUV, and drove off without another word. As the dust settled behind her tires, Jonathan stayed by the gate. He wasn't celebrating, not yet, because Claire wasn't the kind to walk away. She was regrouping, planning, looking for another angle. But Jonathan wasn't done either, because next, he wasn't going after the fence. He was going after what paid for it. The fine notices didn't stop. Every morning a fresh envelope was slipped under Jonathan's door, each marked with a new date and a running total. According to the HOA's math, he now owed over $1,000. He hadn't responded to any of them, not directly. He wasn't planning to pay. Jonathan wasn't interested in playing by Claire's game board. He was building a different strategy, one that didn't rely on threats or meetings. Instead, he focused on the one thing HOA boards feared more than lawsuits: their own paper trail. He began by requesting the HOA's annual budget report, a document they were legally required to share with any resident upon request. He expected resistance, but to his surprise, it arrived within 2 days, delivered by Carl, who now acted more like a silent ally than just a neighbor. "They didn't want me to bring it," Carl said, handing it over. Claire made that clear. Jonathan took the packet and thanked him. The numbers were neat, typed out in columns with color-coded highlights. The line item he searched for jumped out immediately. Community improvements, fence security installation, $8,740. He stared at it. That was no basic fence job. That figure included more than just lumber and cement. He flipped through the attachments until he found a vague invoice labeled simply, "Labor and Materials Lot Rear Access Control Project." No details, no vendor name, no breakdown. Now it wasn't just sloppy, it was deliberate. He set the papers aside and made a call to the county building inspector's office. After a long hold, he reached a soft-spoken clerk who confirmed what he already suspected. No permit had been pulled for fence construction along the easement. In fact, no recent permits had been filed by the HOA at all. No records, Jonathan asked. None, the clerk replied. And if they built on or across a protected easement, we'll need a complaint on file. Jonathan filed it the same day. That evening, he made another discovery. The vendor that had supposedly handled the fence according to a barely legible receipt buried in the packet was a company registered under a man named Eric Nolan. A few searches later, Jonathan found an archived newsletter from 6 months ago. Eric Nolan had just been added to the HOA board as operations chair. The HOA had paid nearly $9,000 for a fence constructed by a board member. No open bidding, no member vote. No permit. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, hands steepled in front of his face. It wasn't just overreach now, it was misuse of funds. He printed the receipts, the budget page, the vendor registration, all of it, and placed them in a new folder, labeled Phase 2. The next morning, he didn't wait. He walked directly into the HOA's next board meeting, held in the rec center near the front of the neighborhood. The room fell quiet as he entered, documents in hand. Claire didn't even look up at first. When she did, she forced a smile. If you're here to contest your fines, there's a form for that. I'm not contesting anything, Jonathan said, setting the folder down on the table. I'm asking how nearly $9,000 of HOA funds were paid to a board member without community approval and for a fence that violated an easement. The room stayed still. No one said a word. I've already filed a complaint with the county, he added. If this is how the board conducts business, every one of you may want to check your liability coverage. Claire's smile vanished. Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Jonathan turned and walked out. He didn't need to argue. The pressure was already spreading. The board was cracking in now. The neighborhood was watching. It only took 2 days. What had started as a silent standoff at a gate was now circulating on every porch, in every driveway, and through every text thread in the community. Jonathan didn't have to say a word. People talked on their own. Neighbors began knocking on his door, quiet ones, the kind who kept to themselves during past HOA meetings. An older couple from across the street asked if he'd really seen the invoices. Another homeowner, a young woman with 2 kids, asked if Claire had really approved the fence without a vote. Jonathan didn't give them speeches. He didn't need to. He simply showed them the papers. By the weekend, Carl told him 3 board members had quietly asked about how resignations worked. One had already submitted a request to take time off for personal reasons. Claire, however, hadn't budged. If anything, she doubled down. She sent out a community-wide email, warning residents about ongoing misinformation campaigns and individuals seeking to destabilize community peace. It was desperate and vague, and it backfired. At the next HOA meeting, the room was full. Claire walked in 15 minutes late, head high, and barely acknowledged the crowd. She rattled through an agenda like nothing was wrong, trying to power through. But the usual silence was broken when a voice near the back spoke up. I want to know where the vote was, said a man named Greg, a quiet handyman who rarely spoke at meetings. Claire ignored him. Then another voice. Why wasn't the community informed about the money? A woman added. I thought any expense over $2,000 had to be approved. Claire froze. She could deflect once, not twice. This isn't the time for interruptions, she said. Stiffly. Jonathan stood. No one's interrupting. We're just reading what the bylaws already say. He opened a binder, flipping to a page. Board members are barred from profiting from board decisions without full community disclosure and a majority vote. That includes construction projects, vendor agreements, and financial disbursements. Claire didn't speak. Jonathan continued. There's no record of a vote, no approved bidding process, and no permit. Yet funds were directed to a company run by a sitting board member. Murmurs echoed across the room. Claire's eyes darted to the few remaining loyal board members, but none met her gaze. You think this is about offense? She said finally. It's about more than that. This community was falling apart before I stepped up. I was fixing it, giving it structure. And you thought fencing off someone's land was a way to do that? Someone called out from the side. Claire's composure slipped. That land was always messy. He had junk in his yard. He left vehicles back there. It didn't look respectable. Jonathan didn't flinch. You don't have the right to define what my home should look like. And you definitely don't have the right to fence off a public easement, Tesla using funds paid by the very people you're trying to control. Someone clapped, then another. A slow ripple of approval built around the room. Claire looked around, as if realizing just how isolated she had become. I'll be submitting a formal motion, Jonathan said calmly, to initiate a full audit of HOA funds from the past fiscal year, with an independent review. The motion will include freezing non-essential expenditures until that's completed. No one opposed it. After the meeting, Jonathan walked home under the evening sky. The air was heavy with summer heat, but for the first time in weeks, he felt clarity settle in his chest. The gate still stood, still his, still unlocked. But what was behind it, what the HOA wanted, was no longer just about control. It was about what they were willing to do to take it, and he had one more move left. The day after the meeting, the neighborhood felt different. People nodded at Jonathan now. Strangers waved. Even Fred, who hadn't spoken to anyone in years, except to complain about leaf piles, offered him a firm handshake and muttered, "Took guts." But Jonathan wasn't celebrating, not yet, because something still didn't add up. Claire had risked too much too early, spending HOA funds without approval, hiring someone tied to the board, building on questionable land. That kind of recklessness didn't come from ambition alone. It came from desperation, which meant she was hiding something bigger. Jonathan's hunch led him back to the county records office. This time he requested historical title transfers for every parcel adjacent to his own, including the gravel road. It took 2 hours, 3 coffees, and the patience of a woman named Rita, who ran the archive room like a library built on sand. But then he found it. A document dated 34 years ago, typewritten, fraying at the edges. A private agreement between 2 original landowners, one of them a man named Gerald Layton, who had once owned both Jonathan's lot and the land where the gate stood. The other party, a now defunct development company that would eventually become the foundation for the HOA. Jonathan sat there staring at the paragraph halfway down the page. A single clause, buried in the fine print. Access along the designated gravel corridor shall remain uninterrupted and perpetual for any parcel descending from Plot for B, regardless of subsequent subdivision or community oversight. Plot for B. That was Jonathan's land. The clause had been filed as part of a development condition, and because it predated the HOA's founding, it overruled any rules they later created. If enforced, it meant that the HOA couldn't block the gravel road of it if they rebuilt the fence 100 times over, and if they had already done so, they could be liable for obstruction of a legally protected right-of-way. Jonathan scanned a copy, placed it with the rest of his growing file, and left. He didn't even get home before someone was waiting for him on the porch. An elderly man in a wide-brimmed hat and dusty boots stood calmly by Jonathan's steps. He looked familiar, though older. His frame stooped, but still steady. He offered a weathered hand. "You don't know me, but you might know the name. Gerald Layton was my brother." Jonathan shook his hand. "Then you probably know more about this road than anyone else alive." The man nodded slowly. He built it himself, leveled the gravel by hand, said every home down this row would need a way out. He didn't trust bureaucrats. Jonathan smiled faintly. "Sounds like a man after my own heart." The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope. Before he passed, he had me make a few copies of that original clause. Said if anyone ever tried to pretend that road didn't matter, they'd need reminding. Inside the envelope was the same document Jonathan had found, but with handwritten notes in the margins, dated and signed. Proof the clause was intentional, not a loophole in Anchor. "I heard what Claire's been trying to do," the old man said, voice low. "You're the first one in years to stand your ground. Don't stop now. She come hard." Jonathan nodded, taking the envelope carefully. "She already has." That night, he wrote a letter to the county again, this time, not just reporting obstruction, but submitting the legal clause. He copied the HOA board, attached the clause, and added a final paragraph. "This isn't a dispute, it's a correction, and if the board chooses to keep building on sand, they'll be the ones who sink." Jonathan hit send. The gate was no longer the battleground. Now, the foundation was cracking beneath the board's feet. Claire's office was quieter than usual the morning after Jonathan's latest letter went viral in the HOA community. For days, emails and phone calls poured in, many demanding explanations about the fence, the fines, and the buried legal clause that no one had seen coming. But Claire stayed tight-lipped behind closed doors. However, the atmosphere was anything but calm. The board was divided. Some wanted to negotiate, to back down quietly, and avoid costly legal battles. Others, Claire especially, believed doubling down was the only way to keep control. She called an emergency board meeting at her house. The usual rec center was closed for renovations. She said, but the turnout was still significant. Most homeowners, who had supported her in the past, sat with uneasy expressions. Claire stood at the front, voice firm but brittle. "We're at a crossroads," she said. "The fence was necessary. That gravel path has been a liability, but recent events threaten everything we've worked for." Greg, the handyman who had challenged her before, raised a hand. "Necessary? For who? Not for the people who live here. You pushed this fence through with no vote. You used HOA money for a project no one approved." Claire fixed her gaze on him. "This community needs order. Without it, property values decline, and we lose control." Jonathan sat in the back, silently observing. His presence was a message of its own. No one questioned why he was there. "Control?" Greg repeated quietly. "At the cost of your own rules." Suddenly, Claire's phone buzzed. She glanced down, then paused. "It's from the HOA attorney," she said, voice tight. "We've received a letter from the county. They've begun a formal investigation into the fence construction and potential easement obstruction." A hush fell. The implications were clear. If the county ruled against the HOA, the fence would have to come down, and the board could face penalties, possibly even personal liability for misusing funds and ignoring zoning laws. Claire's eyes flickered with panic for the first time. She stood, voice rising. "We can fight this appeal, negotiate, but we must act quickly. Jonathan stood as well, or you can stop digging a hole you can't climb out of. The room shifted uncomfortably. Claire's supporters exchanged glances. Jonathan continued, calm but unwavering. You have a chance to fix this? Remove the fence, lift the fines, and start a transparent audit. That's the path forward. Claire's face hardened, and if I refuse, I'll bring this to the Homeowners Association. Meeting, public record, media included, if necessary. Your legacy won't be a thriving community, but a cautionary tale about abuse of power. Claire hesitated. The weight of months of decisions pressed down on her. She looked around the room, some members avoiding her gaze, others nodding slowly. Greg broke the silence. I move. We vote on removing the fence immediately. Hands raised around the room. The vote was overwhelming. Claire slumped back into her chair. Then that's the decision. Within days, the fence was dismantled. Boards came down, nails pulled out, and the gravel path reopened, but the gate remained locked, with a small plaque now affixed. Reading simply, property of Jonathan Fields, not maintained by HOA. It was a quiet reminder. The board had underestimated one homeowner's resolve. The fence was gone. But the neighborhood wasn't quite the same. People walked the gravel road freely again, waving as they passed Jonathan's gate. The reopened path became a symbol not just of property lines or legal rights, but of what happens when a community speaks up. Claire quietly resigned a week after the vote. The HOA held new elections under county supervision, promising transparency and rebuilding trust. Several longtime residents stepped up to volunteer, determined to make sure no one else could wield power unchecked. Jonathan watched all this unfold with a quiet satisfaction, but the locked gate remained his final statement. Every morning he opened the gate just enough to let his truck through, but left it locked from his side. The small plaque caught the sunlight, reminding neighbors and board members alike that ownership wasn't just about fences. It was about knowing the rules and standing your ground. One afternoon, as Jonathan worked on his Jeep in the backyard, a young boy approached, holding a small notebook. Mr. Fields, the boy asked shyly, my dad told me about the gate story, about how you didn't give up. Jonathan smiled, wiping his hands on a rag. That's right. Sometimes, the smallest things make the biggest difference. The boy nodded thoughtfully. My dad says you taught the HOA a lesson. Jonathan looked up at the blue sky, then back at the gate. Maybe, but it wasn't about teaching a lesson. It was about protecting what's rightfully mine and what belongs to all of us. As the sun set, Jonathan stood by the gate and watched the last rays glint off the metal. The neighborhood was quiet, but the history of the fight lingered like a shadow, because sometimes the simplest detail, a locked gate, can change everything. But then came the twist no one expected. A few weeks after the fence came down, Jonathan received a letter in the mail. No return address, just his name on the front. Inside was a single page with a short message typed neatly. You own the gate, but did you know the land underneath is still subject to an old covenant? You may want to check the county archives. Again, Jonathan's eyes narrowed. Curious and cautious, he returned to the archives. Hours later, buried beneath layers of forgotten files, he found an old easement agreement granting public access rights not just to the gravel road, but specifically stating that the gate itself must remain unlocked during daylight hours to allow emergency and utility vehicles access at all times. He smiled quietly. He'd won the battle, but the war was full of layers he hadn't yet uncovered. The gate remained locked, yes, but from dusk until dawn. From dawn until dusk. It was open for everyone. Jonathan leaned back, the realization settling in. Sometimes, control isn't just about owning something, it's about knowing when to open it up. And with that, Jonathan walked outside, unlatched the gate, and let the afternoon breeze flow through.